Dense, regular elastic connective tissue contains parallel-oriented elastic fibers with randomly oriented collagen fibers, and it's found in walls of organs that have to stretch in order to perform their function, such as in large blood vessels and certain ligaments. For instance, you would find this type of tissue in large arteries such as the aorta, which is one of the great vessels that leads out of the left ventricle of the heart. And again, notice that we have two important physical features with this tissue. Okay, we have elasticity, okay, which is the ability to stretch, and it also will recoil, okay? So the ability to stretch and to snap back. Reticular tissue, as the name implies, is web-like. It's composed mostly of reticular fibers produced by fibroblasts, also known as reticular cells, and it forms fine networks that can support small structures like blood and lymphatic vessels. It's found in lymph nodes and in the spleen, and it forms a web-like net that traps old and foreign cells. It also forms part of the basement membrane that supports all epithelia and internal structures of the liver and the bone marrow. Adipose tissue consists of fat-storing adipocytes and surrounding fibroblasts as well as extracellular matrix. The adipocytes can increase in size to a point where the fibroblast and the extracellular matrix are almost invisible. The functions include fat storage, which is a major fuel reserve for the body, insulation, which retains body warmth, shock absorption, and protection. White adipose tissue is the predominant type. It appears white, consists of adipocytes with one large lipid inclusion in the cytosol, and is found deep to the skin as subcutaneous fat and in the abdomen, breasts, hips, buttocks, and thighs. White adipose that surrounds the heart and abdominal organs is also known as visceral fat. Now, brown adipose tissue is less common. It has a brown appearance due to numerous mitochondria in the cytoplasm and a vast blood supply. It contains multiple lipid inclusions that are more readily converted to energy by the body to produce heat in cold temperatures. This, in fact, is one of the ways that animals that hibernate are able to make it through the winter, is the vast amounts of brown fat that help to maintain their body temperature while they sleep through the winter until the spring thaw comes and they're able to go out and forage for food. Specialized connective tissues have specific functions and include three types: cartilage, which is found in joints between bones in the ear, nose, and segments of the respiratory tract; bone, which supports the body, protects vital organs, and provides attachments for muscles that allow for movement. It also stores calcium and houses bone marrow; and blood, which is a unique connective tissue with a liquid extracellular matrix known as plasma, consisting mostly of water, dissolved solutes, and proteins. And we should add one other connective tissue in here while we're on the topic of liquid connective tissue, and that is lymph. Okay, so what is lymph? Lymph is liquid connective tissue transported in lymph vessels derived from interstitial fluid. It's a transport medium, but the point of lymph is that it serves as a way to filter pathogens and cancer cells and dead cells out of the interstitial fluid before returning that fluid back to the circulatory system, where the blood supply meets up with the lymph supply near the right and left subclavian veins. Other specialized connective tissues include cartilage, which is a tough, flexible tissue that absorbs shock and resists tension, compression, and shearing force. The extracellular matrix is collagen and elastic fibers composed of glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans. Two main cell types are found in cartilage: chondroblasts, which are immature cells that mitotically divide and make most of the extracellular matrix. They eventually get surrounded in their own secretions inside small chambers known as lacunae, where they become mature inactive chondrocytes. It's essentially avascular tissue, unlike most connective tissue. The blood supply is limited to the outer sheath known as the perichondrium, which contains dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. Thus, oxygen and nutrients have to diffuse from the blood vessels in the perichondrium through the extracellular matrix to supply the chondroblasts and chondrocytes, and this limits the thickness of living cartilage. And so this is one of the reasons why exercise is important, because it promotes more diffusion of nutrients and oxygen into the cartilage and helps the chondrocytes to live longer. Cartilage can be further divided into three classes based on the composition of the extracellular matrix. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant. The matrix is ground substance with small bundles of fine collagen, and it gives the tissues a glossy bluish-gray appearance. It's found on the ends of bones and joints, where it's termed articular cartilage. It links the sternum to the ribs and frames sections of the respiratory tract, and is also found in the nose. Most of the fetal skeleton begins as hyaline cartilage and is eventually replaced by bone during development. And what's interesting about this is it represents a phenomenon in biology. There's a saying: ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is a fancy way of saying that the events that seem to occur in development mimic the events that we believe occurred in evolution. And this is one example of such a phenomenon. The skeletal system during human development really goes through three basic phases. Okay, it begins as a hydroskeleton. During the blastocyst stage. It's eventually replaced by a cartilaginous skeleton, hyaline cartilage, right? And that's eventually replaced by osseous tissue. And we believe that this is the sequence of events that led to the development of osseous tissue skeletons in advanced organisms that we see on the planet today, such as bony fish, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and so on. More primitive organisms can also still be found. Organisms that have cartilaginous skeletons include the sharks and the rays that still swim the oceans. And examples of organisms with a hydroskeleton would be things like jellyfish. Okay, so very interesting comparison of these two sequences of events. And the reason that this is important is because it seems to imply that the memory of evolution is contained within our genetic material, which directs development. Fibrocartilage is filled with bundles of collagen with little room for ground substance in the extracellular matrix. The fibroblasts reside in tissue in addition to chondroblasts and chondrocytes. We fill the extracellular matrix in this tissue with collagen and elastic fibers. The tissue has tremendous tensile strength with some elasticity, and it's found between bones of fibrous joints, where it forms articular discs that improve the fit of bones in joints. Okay? Examples are shown here. Okay, the intervertebral discs are one example of this. Okay, the pubic symphysis is another. Okay, the pubic symphysis is the joint between the coxal bones It's found between the pubis of the right and left coxal bones. Elastic cartilage contains mostly elastic fibers in the extracellular matrix, which allows the tissue to vibrate. It's found in a limited number of structures, such as the external ear, which helps with the detection of sound in the air, and the larynx, which assists with production of sound. Bone is extracellular matrix made up of about 35% organic components such as collagen and ground substance, which we term osteoid. The remaining 65% is inorganic calcium phosphate salts that make the bone one of the hardest substances in the body. Bone is a dynamic tissue capable of remodeling. This occurs in regions of stress or inactivity. The tension increases osteoblast activity and bone deposition, while compression increases osteoclast activity and bone reabsorption. Osteoblasts are the bone builders, and they're found on the outer surface of bones associated with dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue known as periosteum. And they carry out the process of bone deposition. They synthesize and secrete organic extracellular matrix and chemicals involved in trapping calcium in the ECM. Osteocytes are the fate of osteoblasts that become trapped in their own matrix. They lie in chambers called lacunae. The mature cells are mostly inactive but continue to make and secrete substances important for bone maintenance, while osteoclasts are large multinucleate bone dissolvers. They carry out the process of bone reabsorption. They secrete acids and enzymes that break down both the inorganic and the organic extracellular matrix. These are examples of cells that are termed syncytia. Okay, this is the first example of a syncytia that we've run across. Another example is going to be skeletal muscle. Okay, a syncytia is simply a cell that has multiple nuclei, and it generally forms as a result of multiple precursors fusing together to form one giant cell with many nuclei and organelles contained inside. Blood is a liquid connective tissue. Plasma proteins are not like the fibers found in other connective tissue, but they're smaller and have a variety of functions, including the transport of various substances and the coordination and maintenance of blood clotting, and as well as immune defense. Erythrocytes bind and transport oxygen throughout the body, while leukocytes aid in the battle against pathogens. Pathogens are disease-causing entities. Living pathogens include things like bacteria, mold, and parasites. Non-living pathogens include things like toxins and viruses, as well as prions, actually. Platelets are cell fragments that coordinate blood clotting. Now, one interesting thing about erythrocytes and platelets, okay, is that they are anucleate, okay? Anucleate. So platelets and erythrocytes lack nuclei and are pretty much devoid of organelles. And you might think, why is this? And this is to improve the function of this particular cell type. An erythrocyte doesn't want to take up valuable real estate in the cytoplasm that could be occupied by the oxygen-carrying pigment hemoglobin with organelles, and platelets, which are basically membrane-enclosed fragments of clotting factor, don't want to lose any of that valuable real estate to biosynthetic machinery. As a result, they don't last very long in the bloodstream and have to be replaced rather quickly. Muscle is specialized for contraction. 3 muscle tissue types share a common ability to turn chemical potential energy from ATP into kinetic energy. Walking, breathing, the beating of the heart, and the propulsion of substances through organs result from the contraction of various muscle tissue types. The main component of muscle tissue is the muscle cell or myocyte. It's excitable, meaning that it has the ability to respond to electrical or chemical stimulation, and that response is in the form of a contraction. Two forms of muscle cells based on the arrangement of myofilaments in the cytoplasm include striated muscle cells, whose myofilaments are arranged in alternating light and dark regions so they appear striped or striated under the microscope, and smooth muscle cells that have myofilaments arranged in an irregular bundle or a series of irregular bundles instead of repeating light and dark regions, so they have a slightly different appearance under the microscope. In striated muscle, we have to understand that this overlap that we see of muscle protein is responsible for the dark regions in the striations, and the areas that are light appearing under the microscope are areas of the muscle protein where there is no overlap. And it's going to turn out when we get to the chapter on muscle tissue that this overlapping of muscle protein filaments is responsible for the mechanism of contraction. What we're going to determine in our exploration of muscle tissue is that the ability of these muscle proteins to attach to each other in a process called cross-bridging and pull the overlapping filaments closer together so that the degree of overlap increases is responsible for the contractile process in muscle. And this is powered by ATP and triggered inside the muscle cell by the release of calcium. The endomysium is a small amount of extracellular matrix that surrounds muscle tissue and helps to hold muscle cells together. There's three types of muscle tissue that feature different structural and functional characteristics: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Skeletal and cardiac muscle are striated, while smooth muscle tissue is not. Skeletal muscle tissue is found mostly attached to the skeleton, where its contraction produces body movement. Skeletal muscle must be stimulated by the nervous system in order to contract, thus it is under, to a great extent, voluntary or conscious control. Most skeletal muscle cells are long and extend nearly the length of the entire muscle, and they're often known as muscle fibers. They form by fusion of embryonic myoblasts, resulting again in a syncytia. This is useful for nearly constant synthesis of enzymes, structural proteins, and contractile proteins. And again, form follows function, right? A long cell provides a lot of opportunity for overlap of muscle protein, which provides a lot of opportunity for the cross-bridging that leads to contraction to take place. This generates a tremendous amount of physical force when the muscle contracts. Cardiac muscle tissue is found only in the heart, and it's composed of cardiac muscle cells. Although these cells are striated like a skeletal muscle cell, differences include the fact that cardiac muscle tissue is not under voluntary control, thus the brain does not have conscious control over its contraction. The cells are not multinucleate. They are short, branched, and they are connected to each other by special junctions called intercalated discs. These are dark lines that separate individual cardiomyocytes, not seen in skeletal muscle, containing gap junctions and tight junctions, and this allows the heart as an organ to contract as a unit. So here again we see an example of form following function, right? The reason that we have these unique features, these gap junctions and these tight junctions, are because we have a particular task to do in heart muscle tissue, which is to pump blood around the body. So what do the tight junctions do? The tight junctions hold the organ together So this is going to permit the heart to pump blood without flying apart. And the gap junctions provide for electrical communication. Meaning that charged particles can move quickly from one heart muscle cell to another. This allows electrical signals to spread across the myocardium of the heart, the part that's made up of cardiac muscle tissue, in a relatively uniform fashion, and that is then followed by a mechanical event, which is the squeezing of the heart muscle tissue, which we term systole. Okay, so that electrical signal is called a depolarizing wave. Okay, and the mechanical event that follows that, systole, is contraction. And then what will happen is that the electrical condition of those muscle cells will reset back to its state of polarization across the cell membrane of the cardiomyocytes, and that will be followed by relaxation of the muscle fibers in the heart, and that's a term that we call diastole. Okay. Smooth muscle tissue consists of smooth muscle cells whose contractions are involuntary, just like cardiomyocytes. They're found in the walls of nearly every hollow organ, blood vessel, eyes, skin, and the ducts of certain glands. Consist of flattened cells with one centrally located oval nucleus. The neighboring cells are linked together by gap junctions. Okay, and again, those are electrical communication junctions, and thus smooth muscle tissue in many cases can contract as a unit. Okay, and one of the ways that this happens is when we produce rhythmic wave-like contractions, for instance, in the digestive system, that propel food ultimately from the esophagus all the way to the rectum and the anus. Nervous tissue makes up the majority of the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, and it's composed of two main cell types and their surrounding extracellular matrix: the neurons, which are capable of sending and receiving messages, and neuroglial cells that perform functions that support neuron activity. The extracellular matrix is unique in nervous tissue. It's made up of ground substance with unique proteoglycans not found in other tissues of the body, and contains very few protein fibers. Neurons are excitable cells. Once they're mature, they no longer divide by mitosis, and there's three main components of the nerve cell: the cell body, or soma, where the biosynthetic machinery is found, right? We see the nucleus and many of the organelles here. A solitary axon that extends from one end of the soma and is responsible for moving a nerve impulse from the soma towards a target cell, which could be another neuron, a muscle cell, or a gland, thus illustrating the cell-cell communication core principle. And then dendrites, which are tinier extensions that extensively branch, and they receive impulses from axons of neighboring neurons and deliver nerve impulses to the soma. Okay, you could think of the dendrites almost like antenna. Okay, listening for chemical changes in the extracellular environment that will produce a special type of change in the membrane potential known as a graded potential. And those graded potentials are unique in that they're proportional to the size of the stimulus, they can be excitatory or inhibitory, and they tend to fade with distance. If they're strong enough, if they combine in such a way that their graded potentials add and eventually make their way all the way to the beginning of the axon, which is called the axon hillock, okay, which is the trigger zone for the nerve cell. The hillock would be right about here in this particular nerve cell. If we reach that threshold voltage, then we generate another type of electrical signal called an action potential, which proceeds at one speed in one direction and at one magnitude from where it's created to where it ends up. And where it ends up is the axon terminals, known as synaptic boutons, where we trigger the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters, which get sprayed onto the target tissue. Neuroglia are a diverse group of smaller cells with a variety of functions meant to support neuron activity. They anchor neurons and blood vessels in place. They monitor the composition of extracellular fluid. and they speed up the rate of nerve impulse transmission and circulate fluid surrounding the brain and spinal cord, and they are able to divide mitotically, unlike neurons in the peripheral and central nervous system. So, let's combine all of this together so that we get a bigger picture of what's going on in the body. Okay, so when we coordinate all this, one of the things that we have to understand is that the next level of organization is the organ. Okay, this is defined as two or more tissues combining structurally and functionally to do something that a single tissue alone cannot. A simple organ would be a skeletal muscle. It's composed of two tissues, skeletal muscle and dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. Each has a distinct role. Skeletal muscle allows it to contract. The surrounding connective tissue binds the muscle cells together and supports them so that their activity produces the contractions of an entire organ. More complex organs consist of many different tissue types. An example would be the trachea. It's a hollow organ providing a passageway for air on its way to the lungs. Each tissue layer serves an important role in the function of the trachea, which is conducting air. And so if we look real quickly at some of the different tissues, right, what do we see? Well, lining the lumen of the trachea, we find pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium containing goblet cells that produce mucus. Okay, so what does the mucus do? The mucus traps particulates so they don't end up down in the lungs. We find at the posterior aspect of the trachea, the trachealis muscle, which is smooth muscle tissue, controls the diameter of the trachea. And then we find connective tissue underneath the epithelial tissue. Loose connective tissue attaches the epithelial tissue to the cartilage of the trachea. Okay, so you can see here hyaline cartilage supporting the windpipe, keeping it open so it doesn't collapse when you breathe air in and out. And then you've got on the very external surface connective tissue that is going to basically attach the trachea to the surrounding structures, okay? Dense, irregular connective tissue in this case. And we should also point out that we have a blood supply and a nerve supply to this organ, right? So it's innervated and it also has a source of oxygen and nutrients. Membranes, again, this is the second use of the term membrane. Here we're using the term membrane to refer to a thin sheet of one or more tissues that line a body surface or a cavity. Most consist of a superficial epithelial layer resting on a connective tissue layer, sometimes with smooth muscle. Functions are to anchor organs in place, to serve as barriers, and to function in immune response, and secrete substances. True membranes include the serous and synovial membranes. The serous membranes line a lot of the internal body cavities and secrete a lubricating fluid that allows the internal organs to engage in movement without inflaming and scarring. And synovial membranes are found lining joint cavities, producing synovial fluid, which lubricates and cushions and protects the action of diarthrotic joints, the joints with the greatest degree of movement of all the different joint classes, the synarthroses, the amphiarthroses, and the diarthroses. Membrane-like structures include mucous and cutaneous membranes that don't fit the above structural and functional definitions but perform many of the same functions. So if we look at some true membranes here, these surround body cavities that are not open to the outside world. Examples include serous membranes lining the pericardial, peritoneal, and pleural body cavities. These have the following structural and functional features. They consist of a mesothelia, which is a thin layer of simple squamous epithelium, associated basement membrane, and a layer of connective tissue. They fold over themselves, giving the appearance of two layers, an outer parietal layer that lines the cavity inside which the organs sit, and an intervisceral layer that actually is clinging to the organ. And between them, they generate a serous fluid, filling the space between the parietal and visceral layers that allows freedom of movement without irritation, inflammation, and scarring. And I know it's kind of weird to think about your internal organs as being in motion, but they are indeed, most of them, constantly moving. Synovial membranes line the cavities that surround freely movable joints like the knee or shoulder, and are made up of two connective tissue layers without a layer of epithelial tissue. The outer layer is usually composed of a mix of loose and dense irregular connective tissue, and the inner layer contains synoviocytes, which are modified fibroblasts secreting synovial fluid, which is a lubricant that allows freedom of movement in the joints. Cutaneous membranes, mucous membranes, are examples of membrane-like structures that don't fit the full description of a true membrane. Mucous membranes line all body passages that are open to the outside world, including the respiratory cavity and the digestive system, which is of course open at both ends, as well as the urogenital system. They consist of a layer of epithelia and basement membrane, which is a layer of connective tissue called the lamina propria, and occasionally a thin layer of smooth muscle. It's imbued with goblet cells that produce and secrete mucus and serves functions including protection. Okay? The mucus in the respiratory system, as we've already detailed, traps particulates so they don't end up in the lungs where they would scar the delicate simple squamous epithelial tissue. The mucus in the digestive system is designed to lubricate food as it moves through the pipe and to protect the lining of the gut, and also serves as a mechanism for chemical action. Okay, there are a lot of enzymes that aid in the chemical digestion of foodstuffs, and a lot of that happens at the level of the lining of the gut, okay, where these enzymes are in some cases actually attached to the mucous membrane of the digestive system. Cutaneous membrane refers to the skin, which is the largest organ in the body. An outer layer of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium known as the epidermis provides tough continuous protective surface that protects structures underneath it. The dermis is a layer of loose connective tissue found under the epidermis, and an even deeper layer of dense irregular tissue is deep to that. It's home to many blood vessels, provides a means for oxygen and nutrients to diffuse into the avascular epidermis, and also provides an arena in which the components of the immune system found in the dermis can interact, intercept, and destroy pathogens before they manage to gain access to the blood supply and deeper tissues. Occasionally tissue is injured and it undergoes a repair process. Tissue repair is the process of wound healing. Dead and damaged cells are removed and replaced with new ones, or tissues fill the gap for maintenance of homeostasis, but the process is different in different tissue types. Some tissues are capable of regeneration, where dead and damaged cells are replaced with cells of the same type. When the process is finished, the tissue is returned to its normal functional level. Okay? Examples include, as shown here, damage to the epidermis, not including the basal layer, which is the adult stem cell population that generates the upper layers of the skin. In that case, we can generate fresh epithelial tissue and retain full function. Okay? Another example of tissue that can regenerate, regaining full function, is tissue such as liver tissue. Okay? Other tissues are not capable of full regeneration. The fibroblasts fill in gaps left from injury by a process called fibrosis, where the fibroblasts divide mitotically and produce collagen that fills the gap, and the tissue loses some level of functional ability. The end result of fibrosis is scar tissue deposition, made up primarily of dense irregular connective tissue. And one of the things that you'll notice if you look at a scar on your skin, okay, is that we lack some of the features that we associate with the rest of the skin. You will not, for instance, see hair follicles sebaceous glands, sudiferous glands, and so on, okay, where you have scar tissue. The capacity of a specific tissue to repair is dependent on the tissue's resident cells' ability to engage in mitosis. Epithelial cells typically undergo regeneration. Skin and digestive tract linings are subjected to stress, both physical and chemical, and they must have a mechanism for replacing dead, damaged, or worn-out cells. New cells are derived from stem cells, which are immature cells capable of mitosis, as well as differentiation, which is a process where a cell with a wide variety of fates eventually becomes a cell with a single fate in the adult organism. Other epithelial tissues like liver and blood vessels have mature cells in the vicinity of injuries that are capable of replacing dead and damaged cells by dividing. Most connective tissues heal by regeneration. Connective tissue proper, bone, and blood regenerate easily through the division of resident immature cells. Cartilage is an exception. Resident cells have a limited capacity for regeneration, thus this tissue heals by fibrosis, basically scar formation. Smooth muscle tissue generally regenerates. Cardiac and skeletal muscle tissue generally heals by fibrosis. Smooth muscle cells retain the ability to undergo mitosis and thus can heal by regeneration, while mature skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle have lost that ability and cannot regenerate themselves. One exception are satellite cells in skeletal muscle that can divide and mature into skeletal muscle cells, providing for a limited degree of regeneration. No satellite cells are found in cardiac muscle tissue, thus the injuries are healed by the formation of scar tissue. And again, this has a consequence, right? This means that when we damage the heart muscle as a result, say, of a myocardial infarction, and we cut off blood supply to the muscle tissue and a portion of the muscle tissue dies, it's replaced by scar tissue and the heart is permanently weakened in that region. And the same is to a large extent true in skeletal muscle that has to be surgically prepared if it is torn. Okay, the healing process generates a considerable amount of scar tissue, and thus you experience a loss in strength. Nervous tissue generally undergoes fibrosis. Neurons have lost their ability to divide mitotically and so are incapable of regeneration. Neurological cells retain the ability to divide by mitosis and replace dead and damaged neurons with scar tissue. Okay, so that's the property of the neuroglia here. The glia are distinct from the neurons. The neurons send and receive electrical information. The glial cells support the neurons in that function because they're so busy dealing with electrical information that they don't have time for a lot of the other functions that normal cells can carry out on their own. So they need these sort of personal assistants in order to aid them in their task. The axons of neurons outside the brain and spinal cord are able to regenerate given proper conditions. Okay, and the proper conditions are that the distal and proximal end of the break need to be close enough to each other, and the myelin sheath has to be intact, and that serves as a guide for the regeneration of the axon towards its distal target. Other factors that affect tissue repair include nutrition and blood supply. Tissue repair involves the production of large quantities of protein, such as collagen, and thus requires an adequate supply of amino acids to proceed. Vitamin C is required by fibroblasts to produce functional collagen. A lack of vitamin C actually produces incompletely assembled collagen, defective collagen, in a disease known as scurvy. Blood supply to the injured region has to be adequate to deliver oxygen and nutrients and cells of the immune system, all of which participate in the destruction of the pathogen, if there's pathogens in the area, and also the promotion of the process of tissue repair. Okay, that brings us to the end of this chapter. I'll see everybody in the next module, okay? And I thank you for listening.